All right. Thank you so much for coming today. If you don't know me and you can't spot the resemblance, I am my father's son. My eulogy may be a hair longer than most because there's a big topic to cover, but also because I'd like to include some anecdotes from Dad's remarkable life as well as some background biographical information too. So while it may seem like I'm droning on for about an hour up here, it's only 17 minutes, I promise, but yeah, just want to give you a fair warning. Okay. On September 3rd, 1939, England's Prime Minister somberly announced that World War II had begun. At nearly that exact moment, the young wife of an old-field roughneck prepared to give birth. A West Texas doctor positioned my grandmother on her well-worn dinner table and turned up the volume of the radio so he could hear the news from overseas. Doc Little had lost 2 of his fingers in the First World War, and Dad would later joke this was his first introduction to math. Start with 5, remove 2, and you're left with 3. My grandfather asked the doctor to pay more attention to mother and child, but with half his mind and 2 of his fingers across the Atlantic Ocean, the good doctor delivered a 10.5-pound rascal that would brighten so many lives. It's as if the universe's response to a world gone stark raving insane was to give birth to a person who was kind and optimistic and devoutly honest. Hands down, the most intellectually curious person I've known. Interesting puzzles and places waited for Dad around every corner, and by God, he was going to find them. So you see, contrary to both religious and scientific opinion, it was my father who hung the moon. Dad taught me how to ride a dirt bike and how to think of others and how good a campfire feels on a cold night. He showed me how to give structure to lumber and instructions to computers. He did these things with neither a raised hand or voice, but through example and easygoing discourse, always with a smile that showed he was as turned on by the conversation as I was. How lucky was I to have had a father like that? People of all ages were attracted to his disarming intelligence and confidence. Children seemed to sense a playful curiosity in him that rivaled that of their own, so they immediately trusted him with all their perfect little hearts. And Dad ate that up. He was a generous soul. He helped others pay for school tuition and buy homes and pieces of art and take trips all over the world. And then there were all those wonderful meals he bought for others. You could argue till the world looked level and you weren't going to pay a dime and not even the tip. Just think of all that inheritance going down our throats. Dad wrote tender poetry as easily as he wrote clever computer code. And he drifted to sleep each night with either an open book on his chest or a creative idea in his head, like how to build an intimate outdoor structure by pointing its sides to the solstices, thereby creating a platform whose only purpose in life is to gather humans so that we might share a moment together. Dad was the least petty person I've known. Nothing rattled him. He believed that life is short, so there's just no time to be moody or irritable, or to make others feel small during their existence here. I only inherited a couple of Dad's better traits, along with his hairline and poor short-term memory. But if you want to see all of his best traits in one package, look no further than his remarkable daughter. If you've never met my sister TJ, do yourself a favor and say hi to her and to her amazing family after the service. After I stopped working with Dad a dozen years ago, we saw each other 3 times a week, every week. And I talked to him on the phone the other 4 days. So I shared much of my life with him, but what I'm most proud of is that we shared our friends. My friends, and you know who you are, became his, and his became mine. As our friend David Hood recently told me, I don't know of another 80-year-old person who has so many 50-year-old friends. I loved that. So I have a 226-acre hole in my heart. But in my stronger moments, when I'm able to once again see the color in all those gorgeous rocks Dad collected, I find comfort in the indelible marks he left on dozens of places and on more people than that. Dad's fun-loving spirit was stimulated by his diverse childhood in Wichita Falls. He grew up going to soda fountains and drag races, but he also trained horses and plowed hayfields with his granddad, who drank a Dr. Pepper every morning and lived to be 106. Dad's fourth grade teacher saw her fence post then student spend his quarter each day on books instead of on the cafeteria food for which it was intended. So this saint of a person gave Dad free books so that he could devour Mark Twain and Jack London along with the school's mystery meat. If I could go back in time, I'd kiss that woman because she helped kickstart one of Dad's great passions in life. Reading books was a gift that lasted a lifetime. And believe me, I know of what I speak. I recently discovered that his house contained over 2,100 books. It was like those things begun spawning. And besides reading books, he also had subscriptions to a half dozen science and math and nature journals. Every time I saw him, he would hand me 2 or 3 articles that he cut out for me. I sure missed that. Along with the thousands of books, I also stumbled upon other interesting things in that tightly packed house of his. On his computer was a folder of over 300 poems and essays that he had written over the decades. Some I knew about, most I didn't, all of them amazingly insightful. And then there was the dozens of fun educational gadgets, all science related. I actually found a legally bought vial of radioactive uranium ore. Yeah, only Dan Stone. I can imagine him excitedly using his Geiger counter, and yes, he had a Geiger counter, to see which household materials would block the detection of the uranium the best and at what distances. We'll never know for sure, and that's okay. Dad graduated with honors with a math degree from Rice University, and at Florida State's graduate school, he programmed computers far less powerful than your smartphone to do things like model the weather on Venus. Try doing that on your iPhone. 2 years later, he was the boy wonder in charge of General Foods' entire operations research department in New York. He so loved using math and creative thinking to solve problems that he actually turned down a job offer from famed rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. Luckily, a few of the scientists at the Redstone Arsenal saw something special in young Dan, and they told him that the rocket building company did very little with math that was new or interesting. To protect that fun-loving creative streak of his, they suggested he take the first rocket ship out of town. That advice changed everything. And if I could go back in time, I'd kiss those guys too. Because at the age of just 28, without having ever taken a business course, Dad founded a telecommunications company called Danray, and then another one called Compicon. These 2 companies were the cradle for the Richardson Telecom corridor. Among other things, Dad and his partners saw a need for a digital telephone switch. And soon, the nation's calls would no longer be routed by room-sized mechanical machines or by snarky switchboard operators like Ernestine on Laugh-In, for those of you old enough to remember that. The computerized phone switch was a game changer, and it allowed for things we now take for granted like voicemail, a robust internet, and that idiot in the car next to you texting while driving. Folks still tell me how meaningful it was to work at companies where principles trumped profits, and ping pong games were encouraged to recharge mental batteries. Dad was a natural leader whose encouragement and fairness inspired people to want to work hard for him. He never had a mentor himself, yet only in his 30s, Dad was mentoring several talented minds. Many of them went on to become critical players at Digital Switch, Northern Telecom, Sally Beauty, CNET, and several others. Now, one of Dad's great loves, of course, was mathematics. He could tell you about math and statistics as if something exciting was about to happen, and it usually did. He had a special relationship with math, something I've not seen in anyone else. It wasn't about remembering, it was about feeling. So he could go a decade without touching, say, matrix algebra or a particular form of integration in calculus. Yet when he needed it, it flowed effortlessly from him. It was beautiful. And more importantly, it was so fun to him. Whether he was working on complex engineering problems or discovering a new proof of the Pythagorean theorem, which he did, or answering important questions like, Dad, how many plastic Easter eggs do you figure could fit in our septic tank at the land? He'd grin, hold a give me a minute pointer finger in the air, and seconds later he'd have an oddly accurate estimate, in this case, 9,601. Dad was the Sundance Kid of problem solving. He had a gift at quickly spotting the best path forward, and he actually enjoyed that feeling of confusion when faced with a new problem. Oh, it makes me weep like a disgraced televangelist. But for Dad, it was when his adrenaline pumped and his anticipation peaked. He even had a name for this feeling. He called it managing our ignorance. He knew that the right mindset leads to understanding, to finding harmony from discord, no matter what kind of problem you're facing in life. It sure feels good to be near someone like that. I had the pleasure of writing software with Dad for 22 years at his third company called Salonon, a Salonon being his favorite geometric shape, and who doesn't have a favorite geometric shape? One morning I arrived at our office to find him stacking small wooden blocks in a single vertical column. He had sawed and sanded each block and put a few light coats of shellac on them so they'd feel just right to the touch. He began shifting the blocks near the top of the column so that the tower resembled a freestanding staircase. To my astonishment, the tower soon listed to the side so much that it seemed to defy gravity. A devilish grin crossed his face and he said, "If you give me enough blocks, I could theoretically make this tower lean 1,000,000 miles to the side without it ever tipping over." Well, at age 37, my initial reaction was, nuh-uh. Surely Dad was using glue or magnets, smoke and mirrors, something. The one solid ground beneath me was trembling. But it turns out there's no trick. It's just how nature is. Dad explained that you just need to position the blocks so that their overhangs follow a cool sequence of numbers called the harmonic series. And that led to a delightful discussion about how the harmonic numbers get their name because they describe musical overtones and thus timbre, which is why Chuck Mondernock's well-cared-for trombone sounds so different from Willie Nelson's worn-out guitar, even when they both play the same note. Harmony from discord. I hadn't wiped the sleepies out of my eyes that morning, but Dad had already made playing with blocks feel as exciting as it did when I was 3. That was his gift to us. Dad traveled the country, especially spots west of the Mississippi, with that same love for discovery. It was always about the journey and not the destination. So along the way, he chatted with flint knappers and Dutch oven cooks, anyone with a kind smile and a story to tell. He didn't admire nature from afar or speak with distant reverence about it like it wasn't in the room. He wanted to be with it, and he wanted you there too. So he laid with us under those quaking aspen trees, and he sat wrapped in packing quilts as meteor showers drenched the night sky. And he rode dirt bikes with us on scenic trails all over the Rocky Mountains. As Dad said in his eulogy to his good friend Don Hale, these were more than places. They were shared moments bursting with thought and feeling. Back in the 1970s, while Dad was raising 2 kids and 2 companies and reading 3 books at a time, I was tripping over my shin guards in the 1st grade. My youth soccer team gave birth to a beautiful extended family known simply as the Group. The Hales and the Mondernocks sure added a lot of joy to Dad's life and to mine too. And it was around this time Dad noticed that the Dallas suburbs were missing the expansive fields and worn-out tractors of his youth. He wanted to fix that, and as usual, he came up with the best possible solution. If he couldn't bring the country to Lake Highlands, he'd bring us to the country. Brushy land is where kids grow up and adults play like children. And it was on those enchanting 226 acres that I saw firsthand what Dad had learned in his youth. He made cleaner cuts on lumber using a chainsaw than most people could make with a circular saw. He would confidently cut down a dead tree so it landed just a foot to the left of his favorite ball cap. He could build, chop, cook, hammer, saw, and shoot. In my pre-adolescent, self-absorbed mind, I wondered, how did he learn how to do those things so quickly? Dad loved that land, but he loved sharing it with you even more. While building those remarkable structures out there, Dad really would periodically drop a gloved hand to his side, take in the surroundings, and say out loud, "Isn't this great?" And he never worked from a set of detailed plans. The bliss of being in the moment meant the pleasure of figuring things out on the fly. For instance, when he first pondered building a rock column entrance to the land, I said with some trepidation, we had never worked with rock before. He grinned and said, "Won't it be a thrill to figure it out?" And there you have it, the Tao of Dan in one perfect sentence. When I was a boy, Dad and I saw two men leaving brushy land in a car. We reported it to the local sheriff, who seemed utterly disinterested in our story. But as we were leaving the police station, Dad was asked about the trespassers' race. When Dad answered, a sense of urgency washed over the sheriff, and he began cussing a blue streak and using racial slurs. It frightened me. The lawman angrily asked Dad why he hadn't mentioned that the two men were black. Dad was intimidated by no one. So he leaned into the large, angry man, and he said with the strength of steel, "Because you hadn't asked." Dad had this wonderful Atticus Finch way of being a lens for you to see a better path. That sheriff suddenly seemed small and foolish to me, and I was no longer afraid of him. Once again, Dad had stopped the ground from trembling. Somehow, at a very young age, in 1950s Northwest Texas, he reached the only conclusion that his restless mind could make. We are at our best as a community of equals, with every member deserving dignity. Dad enjoyed being silly, making you feel good. So he'd ask waitresses for watermelon juice just to see them smile. When Billy and Don Hale joined him on long drives, Dad playfully renamed Billy Road Noise. At the top of a high mountain peak, he secretly placed a 10-pound rock in Jason's backpack for the long hike down. He hung empty pinch scotch bottles in a tree at Brushyland and would often declare in the hushed tones of a wildlife naturalist, "Ah, there's the seldom seen pinch tree." And we all had fun making Dad feel good too. He chuckled every time the normally reserved Don Hale did some of that fancy trick riding of his. He always beamed when he told me about the conversation he had with his friend Philip during their weekly breakfast. Nancy's clever holiday letters put Dad in stitches, and my sister's tender stories about the kindergartners she teaches made him smile to no end. While driving to the Rockies for their annual dirt bike vacation, his friends Richard and Jim devised a way to drip motor oil onto their own exhaust manifold, causing harmless smoke to billow behind their van at will. Then they used a CB radio to contact my startled father, who was following closely behind, to ask him if their van was on fire. After several calls back and forth, Dad eventually caught on. I sometimes wonder what the world would have been like without Dad. Would the Richardson Telecom Corridor have existed? Maybe. Would Sears have sold as many out-of-style shirts? Doubtful. What's certain is that without Dan Stone's generosity and infectious spirit, there would have been fewer businesses, fewer graduates, fewer smiles, and fewer visitors to offbeat gyms like the Top of the Old Pass in Red River, New Mexico, or that quaint bookstore in Archer City. What a loss that would have been. I admire how much of life Dad figured out largely on his own, the complicated business deals, the mathematics, the importance of equality and kindness, the enormously positive outlook on life, all done without a guru or a mentor. He now stands as a monument to the pleasure of finding things out. So I'll finish by relating 5 words of wisdom that he found out during his life. 1, never stop learning. 2, be friendly, including at work. 3, never pass up an opportunity to take a leak. 4, Give any child near you a few minutes of your complete attention. And lastly, when building an outdoor structure, use a 4x6 even when a 4x4 would do. It just looks better. Thank you for listening to me today and for loving my father.
Wow. I didn't think I would start this already in tears, so that was wonderful. We all know the person we are remembering and honoring today as Dan. Two of us called him by a slightly different name, different by just one letter, Dad, and my kids called him Grandan. Dad, however, often referred to himself, really always, as Dan, even to Brad and me, in cards and letters and even phone messages. That's how interwoven the notion of being our parent and being our friend, or companion in life, as he once said, was for him. I want to thank my brother for providing a wonderfully complete and moving eulogy. His connection to our dad was so close and daily and deep, it was an amazing relationship to witness. My connection was more remote, albeit frequent and also deeply meaningful, but not one that was easy to witness. Brad and I have remarked upon the variety in our connections and communications with him as we have sorted through the impacts of Dad's death this past month and a half. After moving to Virginia in 1989 at the age of 25, a decision of mine that Dad did not judge but also did not like at all. My connections to him were in the forms of visits in which I lived in his home with him for a few days each year, usually at Thanksgiving. Through the mail, his sending of hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles to me, mostly about language development and education, but also about Texas things like his grave disappointment in the state's political leaders and his delight in the success of one of its baseball teams. And also in phone calls. Oh, those phone calls. They were relaxed and quiet and clear, very one-to-one and easy to hear. In the past several weeks, we talked for about half an hour, 5 or more times. Past several years, we talked for about half an hour, 5 or more times a week. Every call referenced Brad and what the two of them had recently done together, from building or fixing something at Brushy to splitting fries at the Burger House. And then we covered a variety of topics. Our topics, current events, funny things my kindergartner said, memories from his childhood, COVID, teaching math, language development, whatever he had recently creatively concocted for his dinner, the toppings that Susanna was putting on our pizza while we talked, his health challenges, my health challenges, little home improvement projects, problem solving of all kinds, politics, all within the framework of our shared hardwired optimism and wise skepticism. My educational and professional background is in child development. I am fascinated by the impacts of early childhood and how important those early relationships are. Dad provided a steady, solid upbringing for us from day one. He was also quite busy doing business things with some of you during those early years. He and I actually connected most fiercely and thoroughly in the years following Dan Ray and CompuCon, even following my move from Texas and following my own busy years of raising little kids. In many ways, our strongest connection blossomed when I was in my late 30s and he was around the age I am now. The past decades of his guidance and humor and emotional nearness have been an incredibly gift. For those who lost good parents prior to their own middle age, I am deeply sorry. I am so grateful for the privilege of having had Dad for 60 years. He is baked into who I am, how I teach, how I lead, how I love. He and I kind of grew up together in our middle and older ages. He became more emotion-filled in words and deeds as the years went on. I watched him change and he watched me, evolving together for sure. I soaked up his professional guidance even as a kid. I read his Starting and Growing a Business document right after it was written when I was just turning 18. And I reread it at least twice more. I lead a progressive K-8 school in the Appalachian Mountains with so much of his advice in my head and heart. I am lucky to be enjoying that magical job mixture that Dad always described as working hard, doing what you love. He wrote some musings when he turned 55, and I recently reread this statement of his. I cheated boredom almost all my life, using a hobby for a livelihood, constantly confusing work and play. His curiosity was amazing. He was eager to learn something new and always planned to add to that knowledge. You can imagine the number of labeled file folders and 3-ring binders that we have found in Dad's house. And by we, I mean Brad. He is certainly doing the heavy lifting on this. Baseball, for example, got a 3-ring binder. It was a new one, and it had just had some terms and definitions in it. He was clearly going to add to that one. My cancer, though, just got a little file folder, and I'm guessing that's because he bet on it being temporary and therefore not requiring a whole 3-ring binder. That folder also contained some terms and definitions he had printed off the internet, along with a piece of legal pad paper with sweet, hopeful notations he had made on how I reported feeling when he gently spoke to me after each chemo treatment last year. Curiosity, kindness, and present-mindedness. That's another striking thing about Dad, how in the moment he was. When he was with you, he was with you. I strive to be more like that, for today is the only garden we can tend, right? He set good examples for so many good ways to be. And he was so damn generous. So many ideas and plans he supported by generous words or dollars or both. You know, he was sometimes asked by little kids who saw him at a gas station or in his neighborhood if he was Santa Claus. He wasn't into the lie of Santa, so he never played along, but that beard and the twinkle in his eye did seem to communicate something magical. The twinkle and smile were still there when I last saw him at Thanksgiving, but there was also a visible hint of pain and some frustration. He sure took us by surprise, and yet he didn't. He laid it out years ago, but plans like that are not real until they are real, and you never think it's going to be today. Dad was someone that many of us trusted with our lives. Now he needs us to trust him with his death, and I'm getting there. I have recalled several times during my life, and again vividly in these past weeks, a time long ago in which Dad and I were standing together on the driveway at Bucks Hill. That means I was probably a grade schooler, which puts him in his 30s. I think we were loading up for a trip to Maybank or something. I noticed a monarch butterfly on the front of the car. Its wings were open and it was staying in place long enough for us to really marvel at the color and design. After a moment, Dad noticed that it was caught in the grill and was damaged in a way that would prevent it from ever getting free again. He raised his booted foot and smashed it. I looked up at him and he quietly said, "It shouldn't have to suffer." And that was that. It was gruesomely beautiful. I trusted his judgment then, and I have to trust it now. I think we all do. He would want us to. There are many points of intersection that many of you had with my dad that I did not. And I know how much those places of mutual interest meant to him, how they filled him up. I did not share his intense love of math, but he taught me that math is beautiful. Thank goodness he had Philip and Brad to share in the details of that. I didn't build structures at Brushy, but I wonder at every single one of them. Thank goodness he had Brad and Jason, Don and Chuck, and many others of you to work alongside him. I didn't ride motorcycles or four-wheelers in Red River, but I understand his attraction to those Rocky Mountains, a place that my kid now calls home. What I did have with Dad were words, lots of them. Words in person, words on the phone, words in letters, words in articles, words in books, his words, my words, everyone's words. From the kids I babysat when I was a teenager to Rachel Maddow a couple of months ago. We talked about them all. Amazing how much a person who loved numbers so much could also love words just as much. In his musings at age 55, which he titled 55 Thoughts About Choice, Chance, and Change, he wrote about lots of things and people that he believed in, wondered about, and cared about. There were two places in which he started a brief sentence with the words, "I love." You know what the endings of those sentences were? Really heavy-duty rainstorms and maps. So let's find him in every rainstorm and on every map. Okay, I'll close with this, Dad. 3.1415926535897932384626433, and it goes on forever just as you will. Thank you.
So my name's Jason Hale, and as I was sitting there listening, I was thinking, how am I going to do this? And I wish I could have done one of Dan's quick exits, as he liked to do, where when he was ready to leave, he just left. But I will try to be brief. So what I wanted to share with you is some of my memories of Dan. My earliest memory was of Dan when Brad and I started playing soccer, when Brad was in first grade and I was in second. That would have been around 1972 or 3. So that would have been 51 years ago. I remember Dan, we started playing, we didn't have uniforms, so we had white t-shirts. And I remember Dan using a marks a lot to write the numbers on our jerseys. Then I wrote the words integrity, generous, and punctual. I remember Dan's absolute integrity, and I remember a story that he said when and Brad and I were in the back of the truck as we went out to Brushy, where he said, this was when he still owned companies, and he said, you know, if I found out an employee stole or took a pencil home, I would fire him. And I couldn't believe that. I was like, what? And he's like, well, it's not theirs. And I don't know whether he was trying to make a point to Brad and I about, because he denied that he said it later. And I learned never to really argue with Dan, because when I tried to, he was usually right. He was always right. But what I learned from that was, if it's not yours, it's not yours. You don't own it, leave it. And then generosity. Dan sold the house on Bucks Hill to my parents, and I know that was probably a great deal to my parents. And at some point, he said, you know what? You're done. The house is yours. He did the same thing with the loan he gave me for my school when I went to A&M. At some point, he said, you know what? You're done. It's paid for. I mean, he was the most generous man. And then punctual. Dan was always on time. When he was coming over for dinner, I could always count on looking out the window and seeing him pull up at 5 minutes till whatever time he was supposed to be there. And he would sit there until it was time to come in and walk in. I wanted to share a story about when y'all lived on Caribou. Brad and I drove a 1975 bright lime green VW Rabbit. And we would cut through a neighbor's house on Caribou, through this person's driveway, to get over to Estate Lane, I think. And so I drove through there one time, and the owner was standing there and started cursing at me, and my window was down, and as a dumb teenager, I started cursing at him and went on through. And of course, this person later saw my car, bright green, sitting in front of Caribou, the house on Caribou, came down and talked to Dan, and Dan made me write a letter of apology and walk it down and take it to the person and apologize. And he was a father to me, as much as my father was. Then there's the Brushy trips, the countless trips where Dan and Brad would pull up in front of our house in a huge Chevy truck, 4 doors, 4-wheel drive, stick shift, that took a lot of effort to push the clutch down. But anyway, we would load up and head out to East Texas, and Dan would use the time to try to teach. He was always teaching. He was always wondering about things and trying to get us to wonder about things and be curious. And here were Brad and I, teenagers in the back seat, just couple of knuckleheads playing grab ass as Dan tried to describe some astronomical or math problem, but I mean, it helped us. We learned to be curious. The Red River trips, and as Brad mentioned, Dan asking if I would carry something down for him, and I handed my backpack to him, thinking it was some trash or something, and it was a big 10-pound stone that I carried down the mountain for him. There was the dinners at my parents' house. My mom loved to cook chicken tenders, and Dan loved the chicken livers and gizzards. He's the only person I ever knew that ate the gizzards. And then most recently was the trips to Brushy Land recently this past year, where we rebuilt Brushy Hinge and we got the land ready for Thanksgiving. As Brad was out on the tractor mowing, and Dan and I would stand around and he would pull out his folded piece of paper, and I'd ask him, what are our tasks today? And he would tell me, and we would go about those tasks. And those are memories that I'll never forget.
So, to the next generation, the old-timers. A lot of you have known Dan, knew him as long as I did, over 50 years, and many of you can say you knew him that long as well. Not everybody, but he was in my life a long time. Spent a lot of time thinking about what I might say today, writing it down, editing it. It's already been said. I'm done. No, I'm not really done, but I will, maybe I can touch on a thing or two that hasn't been said. Much of it has. But I want to thank TJ and Brad for letting me say a few words today. And I'm going to start with a Ralph Waldo Emerson quote about a successful life, which Dan certainly lived. To laugh often and much, to win the respect of intelligent people and the affection of children, to leave the world a better place, to know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. Dan succeeded beyond Ralph Waldo Emerson's wildest imagination in almost every regard. So I also want to thank Dan for his friendship and for the enrichment that he contributed to my life. Many, many other people that I know. The Hale Mondernock Stone family, you've heard a lot about that. I have met so many friends through him. CompuCon people, Philip, Richard, Kylan, Becky. I think I saw Mike Walker here, Mike Carr, Jack Gilstrap, a bunch of people from the old days, way back when. You know, when I first met Dan and we were getting acquainted, we were telling what we did, and Dan said one of his, before he told me about CompuCon and Dan Ray, those very significant things that Brad told you about, he told me one of his jobs was designing the size and shape of cereal boxes. I thought, what the hell kind of a job is that? That was, fortunately, I've always been pretty good at keeping my mouth shut. So I didn't say that and display my ignorance about what kind of a complicated job that actually is. Probably when I said I was a musician, Dan probably thought the same thing. What the hell kind of a job is that? But I soon learned a lot. One thing has already been mentioned about Dan, and I said, while he was not a teacher by profession, he was a teacher by nature. All of it, probably nobody in here cannot say that they learned something, even one little thing from Dan. Most of us learned a lot of things from Dan. Roadside geology, astronomy, history. That man had a curiosity level that I have never seen. He read, he read more in a day than I did in a month. And that was the key to learning for him. That's where the knowledge was. Another quote that I saw was by a guy back in the 15th, 16th century. I can't have it down here somewhere, but I kind of have to pick my way through because a lot of this has been said. This guy said, if I ever get any money, I buy books. If I have anything left over, I buy food and clothes. Dan valued books, and he valued the learning. There were probably a couple of things, probably only one thing that I knew more about than Dan, and that was music, for what it's worth. But he was curious about music. We talked about it. He sent me, every once in a while I'd get an envelope in the mail, and it would have an article from Scientific American or another thing. It was about music, not the music that I knew anything about. It was really about math or physics, one of those things, with a whole bunch of complicated formulas. I would read it, but I couldn't understand it. But he would also, once in a while, I'd step out onto my front porch and find a book laying there, and have a little sticky note with a note from Dan. Yeah, I thought you might enjoy this. Or turn to page 76, first thing. Or for no reason at all. Or what the hell, you know. So he'd leave me a book. He wouldn't ring the doorbell. He'd just leave. Of course, he probably knew I was sleeping. Dan and I were so different in so many ways. It's kind of a wonder, I suppose, that we had a friendship. He was up close to when I was going to bed, probably. So he didn't ring the doorbell out of consideration. I was probably still sleeping. One thing probably that I did better than him was ride a motorcycle. That's about the only thing I probably ever did better than him. But he learned fast, and he was competitive. So I suppose you know that. He wasn't going to be too far behind. He didn't want to be left back there. It's already been mentioned, almost everybody has mentioned his generosity. He was a guy that, he got some money. This money was only worth what he could do with it to enjoy it. And he shared his what he had with a lot of people. When he bought Brushy Land, we worked down there. You saw some of the pictures. Built those buildings. When he got the gate up, put a lock on it, and he handed me a key on a little bit of log chain about this long. Here's your key. He gave one to Don Hale as well. Here's your key. You go there whenever you want to do that. Some of the Red River trips we took. For a few years, we traveled together. He'd pay all the bills, all the travel bills, all the gas, the room, the cabin, everything. And then sometime later, I said, Dan, I haven't got the bill. Well, I'll get it to you. So he'd get it to me, and I'd look at it and say, Dan, I don't think it has everything on here. I don't think it's right, you know. Or I knew it wasn't right. And he said, this is how much I'll take. If you give me more, I'll tear up the check. And we had a little history of he and I taking each other to dinner for our birthdays, at least sometime during the year. Didn't have to be on our birthday. And he always took me to the great places, most expensive places that we could find with steaks and everything. If I took him to a place like that, he said, "Now, I know what you're doing. You're trying to get even. You're trying to get even." A few years ago, there was a film out, I think it was about after the Enron scandal. I think it was a movie called The Smartest Guy in the Room, The Guys in the Room. Probably all of us consider Dan the smartest guy in the room, long before that and long after that. But you know what? He always told me about how smart the other guys were that he was working with. How smart Mike Walker was, Philip, all those guys, how smart those guys were. And I never heard him refer to any of those guys as working for him. Yeah, he was the boss, he was the owner. He never referred to people as working for him. He worked with them. They worked with him, he worked with them. And that's the way he wanted it, and knew that that's the way it should be. That's why he has all these devoted former employees, some of them here today. Dan was always the leader. In any group that I ever knew about of 2 or more people, Dan was the leader. It could be a big group, it could be just 2 of us. He did where we went, when we ate, when we went home. Is always the leader. It's like he's the Pied Piper. And he cast a large shadow, as they say. His influence was wide. I knew people who knew his name, didn't know him, knew about him. Oh, Dan Stone, I know stuff about that guy. He was like use a solar system analogy. He was the sun, and we were revolving around him. Not that he wanted it that way. It was not an ego thing for him at all. It's just the way we all look at it. He was the guy. We all were around him. Summer trips, Red River trips with the Compicon guys. I was an outsider. They knew about things. They talked about things. I had no idea, but I was accepted. I couldn't understand, the computer stuff and all the other things they were talking about, but I was a part of the group, and it was always great. A couple other little things always been mentioned in some of the pictures. These are just little short things. I recall Dan always having a red felt tip pen and a folded up piece of yellow legal pad in his shirt pocket. He always had a shirt with a collar, the tail out. And he always had, okay, I'll get that out, He knew a formula for everything. Oh yeah, here's how you do that. He loved puzzles, he loved math, that's already been on a mission. So I'll try to skip forward here. Unlike most of you, I had the good fortune and now comforting experience of visiting with Dan a few times shortly before he died. None of us really had an opportunity to say a proper goodbye to him face to face, but I have an idea his spirit is living around here somehow, and hopefully he's hearing all these wonderful things being said about him today. I actually, by Thanksgiving time, the last trip down to Brushy Land, he was really not getting around well. He was in a lot of pain, and went home after that and didn't go out unless he had to go to a doctor's appointment. And I was able to go over and visit with him several times. I brought him some food, some homemade soup on one occasion. I offered to bring food more times. He said, no, I get stuff here. He was a little independent-natured about that. I said, I can pick up something, Dan. I can bring some. No, it's okay. But he was open to visits. So I said, well, how about if I come over and visit? Oh, yeah, that'd be good. So I did go over several times. I met with Philip and Dan one time out on the porch in front of the fire one morning. That was a regular thing for them. I was privileged to be a part of that at one time. So I am somewhat comforted in that while we didn't actually say goodbyes at that time, we talked. Dan always had something interesting to talk about. And in those last visits, they were a little bit philosophical, I guess. We talked a little bit more than usual about the past. Talked about how vibrant and clear some of the memories were, even riding down a motorcycle trail, remembering sticks and stones and leaves and all that kind of stuff. So we talked a lot about the past. We also talked a little bit about what future we may have. And life and death is part of life. So we covered the spectrum a little bit in those conversations. They were not maudlin or depressing, but Dan had something in his mind, I believe, at that time. And like I said, even though we didn't say goodbye, it did in a way. So I feel fortunate to have been able to do that, and we'll always remember those times. So I'll wrap it up here. Like all of you, I was considered Dan to be one of my very best and closest friends. I'll always miss him. I have another life success quote. This one is by Bob Dylan, and it said, "Man is a success if he gets up in the morning and gets to bed at night, and in between he does what he wants to do." Dan certainly did that, and was very fortunate to be able to do it, and that's what he did. And as I said, he did like music. He tried to learn something about it. He conducted some experiments on it over at his house. He bought a keyboard. He did stuff Brad was talking about. He liked Willie Nelson, and we shared an interest in that. And as I was just going through my mind, there's a song called "My Way" that you're all familiar with, I'm sure, actually written by Paul Anka. You may not know that, but he did. Dan did it his way. And I'll finish with a Willie Nelson thing that, he did like Willie, and I was fortunate to do a little work with Willie at one time. One of his songs is something called, which I think is appropriate for this farewell to Dan. The name of that song was "I Still Can't Believe You're Gone."
I'm Nancy, and I'm probably not going to tell you anything that you haven't heard from the people who knew Dan the very best, but maybe a few specifics that haven't been mentioned. I've known Dan about 34 years, which is only a fraction of the time many of you have. And you know that you've heard all today that the Stones, the Monadnocks, and the Hales had a Red River tradition for many, many years. Every summer their families would go and continued to go off and on after the kids were grown. And so I and a bunch of others here are part of what we call Red River Group 2.0. We started horning in on the tradition in 2003, traveling with Brad, Dan, Chuck, sometimes Jason and others, to Red River to see the Aspen in all their October glory, and mostly because Dan made it sound so fun. Gasoline-powered toys, high mountain picnics, scenic outlooks, and wild tales of earlier vacations in those mountains that we came to love. One year, all of our adult children and grandchildren showed up, and there were 24 of us. Seating at restaurants was a challenge, but what a grand time we had. Most of those children and the older grandchildren are here today. And some of them don't live in Dallas, but would not miss this particular send-off. So I stand here for the Specks and the Spears, P.J. Ward, and the Fergusons to tell you that Dan was more than a friend. He was family. Every one of us could tell Dan stories, and will if you ask. But I'm the one up here, so I'm all you got for a few minutes. Some of you know, and maybe some don't, that Dan loved poetry. I know that's been talked about today. He was a big fan of Carl Sandburg, and he gave me a copy of his work early in our friendship, making me a fan too. He and I have both written poetry over the years and sometimes shared our works with one another, getting encouragement and feedback. One time, he really liked something I'd written, and he called me out of the blue and just read his favorite lines from my poem to me over the phone with obvious delight. One time, kind of like Chuck mentioned, well, many times I found books on my porch, but one time in particular, I found a book of verses with the inscription inside from Dan that said, "Nancy, I give these words to you." Many years ago, I wrote a slim volume about my family's ranch in Colorado that had meaning for about 25 people on the planet. When the copies came, I shyly gave one to Dan. It was a work day, but Dan stopped everything and sat right down to read my little book, finished it, and called me to come by so I could sign it to him and we could talk about it. Who does that? Dan. I have two of his shorter, simpler poems I would like to read you today. One I'd never seen, but Brad discovered after Dan's passing and shared with me. Everyone in this room will recognize the Dan Stone they know in the poem, "I Am a Child." When a squirrel jumps to the windowsill or a butterfly flitters by, I'm a child. When a mockingbird sings or clouds form a face, the years slip aside. When clean sheets smell fresh or flannel softly warms my skin, difficulties ease. When sorrows dwindle and smiles swell, I'm pleased to feel that child inside rise again. I reckon I'm only as old as the next sunrise. Forthcoming changes may not be anticipated, yet can still be welcome. I'll just ease back as the worries fade and the present rules as it would a child. The next poem needs context. Dan took pains, as has already been said, to get to know young people. He loved watching them grow and learn and thought their ideas and thoughts were important. One of my granddaughters told me that Dan always treated her like an intellectual equal at any age. This same granddaughter lost her dad when she was 13. I knew Dan had reached out to her, but never knew what he said. With her permission, here is what he wrote to her. As your heart falls to the ground, I wish that I could carry some of your pain at your dad's passing. I liked him, appreciated him, and respected him. You will do well with only a small amount of his strength and determination. Others will tell you that time will ease the hurt, but I won't offer that. Rather, treasure the burden as part of your life's experience with him. In your heart and in your memory, build on it. That way, he remains a part of the structure of your life. These words made a difference to her, so when Dan died, she thought they would also mean a lot to Brad and sent them to him. In thinking about who we've lost and who we celebrate today, I thought they would mean something to all of you.
Well, this is an important day because I think we all have our own thoughts and feelings about Dan, that they're special and we'll never forget them. So I want to talk a little bit about my relationship with Dan and what I came to think about him. First of all, I'm Philip Lindsley. Dan was my friend. I've been around him and worked with Dan for over 50 years. Basically, I'm going to say, how would I describe Dan if it just came up? So just the phrases to talk about Dan. He was an unbelievably good person. You mentioned the generosity, but it was more than that. The idea that you were important, not that he was important. He completely loved his family and friends. They were all important to him. We thought about it every day, every time we got together to talk. He mentioned family and friends. He enjoyed the world and the good people in it, the entire thing. It was not just that he appreciated his life, he appreciated the fact that there were other people out there that were good and worthwhile. You may not know this, but he loved the outdoors. So that's actually, a lot of things have already been said about that, and I think you know it, but I just wanted to throw that in there. There were also, these are other things that have been said, he's extremely smart. He was very creative. We talked about the poetry, the writing. He could write stories that captured your imagination. You'd sit down and read it, and you couldn't believe that it would come from Dan, because Dan was completely different from those things. He wrote a story about a prisoner that was in jail and could only live by what he saw out the jail window through the bars. I have a copy of that story, and I have a lot of Dan's stuff too, if you want to ever look at it. Outside, I have 3 documents that you can look at. One is starting a business and how to run it. The other is how to be a good manager, sections from that. And the other was one of Dan's trip lists, things that we were going to do and how to plan and how to carry out those plans when we go to Red River. I have probably 10 copies of those. This is one of them, and I think you might enjoy it. So he was talented in countless ways. He could solve problems in math and do their proofs as well. So he didn't just sort of on the surface understand it. He knew definitely deeply about it. And he could help people with personal problems. We talked about all of his interests, but one of them was making people happy and helping them get through life. He never stopped finding ways to help people. It was just in his heart, it would happen that he would see somebody that in need. It could be anything. It could be money, it could be support, it could be words of confidence. He would go to it and do it. He was totally unselfish. This is a thing that I've never really seen before. That what he had and wanted was to help others, not that he had to gain something. Even all the things that he built and the people that he helped, he was never selfish about it. It was always for you. He was a terrific guide and leader. I think we all know that. He built a lot of businesses, CompuCon one of them, Sal-Anon another one, and also Dan Ray Systems and the Digital Switch Company. So he had behind him a lot of business activity, a lot of business success. I want to talk about just one element of that and how Dan would react. He was a unique manager. He always wanted people to enjoy their work. When he came to your office, it was always about you and what you were working on. It was not about him, never about him. When he came to see you, he was talking about you and the things that you had done. He showed appreciation and approval of your work, would ask, questions to help you show what you knew. You knew that he was impressed and proud of you. He made you feel good about yourself every time he came to see you. Another thing about Dan is for the past few years, we had weekly meetings. Once a week, we would get together for an hour or two. It was over breakfast, and we'd have coffee as well. In hot weather, we met at Cindy's Deli on Central Expressway because they had good air conditioning. So it was early in the morning, but we didn't want to be hot. In cold weather, we had Starbucks coffee and butter croissants at Dan's house. We would always sit in front of his outdoor fireplace to enjoy these things and to talk. The fire was always bright and hot because Dan built it, and even while we were sitting there, he was making it bigger. Hopefully, the temperature at those times when it was cold was under 35 degrees and the wind was at least 10 miles per hour. So we're sitting out there in front of this fire, and the only thing that was keeping us alive was that fire. It was a perfect place to have wacky discussions, and we did. We talked about anything and everything. Family and friends, obviously. Other people we knew and liked, how incredible people are, the things that they accomplish. And that's each of you, but it's also each category and class of person. It is amazing what people have accomplished overall. We talked about memories from the past, and CompuCon, of course, experiences, trail bike trips, which were fun and very memorable. And Dan, that was one of the things we always talked about. Fun interactions with others. We would recall what happened when we just had brief meetings with other people and tell each other about it, and it was fun. We both loved the beauty, but he had a special appreciation for mathematics, which has been said several times here. Dan was a much better mathematician than I was. He would deep dive into it and understand. I would be on the level, and I'd ask him questions, but we both worked on it and enjoyed the beauty of math. He also loved the beauty of the universe and the amazing things in the universe. What's out there, we think we're important. Just think about, there's 13.2 billion years ago, we can see what the universe looked like using new telescopes. And Dan was really into that. We worried about the crazy things that were going on that are going on in the world right now. And those discussions were hard, but not discomforting, because Dan was a bright person, and I mean that in personality and the way he made you feel. We both realized we were very lucky in our lives to be born when we were, to have experiences when we were, the way growth was going on after the war, after World War II, and that was just a lucky feeling for us at all times. Okay, what Dan meant to me. Dan was my best friend. I know that other people here in the audience feel the same way. There will never be another person like Dan. Dan helped me immensely for 50 plus years, for the 50 plus years that I knew him, and I learned so many things from Dan. But for me, he was the standard bearer for ethics, morals, hard work, and good times. I will never forget him. Thank you.